I'm Ashish, and I head cloud engineering practice at Srijan from a technical perspective. Srijan has been in business for almost 19 years, but like majority of our business and core strength actually comes from the DXP. But in 2017, we founded 3 new business units, out of which cloud engineering is one of those. And right away from 2-member team back in 2017, and in fact, Rajeev happens to be the third team member. So we have actually sort of scaled up to 40 plus at this point of time. It has been a great journey. And then while we started this particular practice, right, like one thing which we wanted to do, like we didn't want to end up any other, SI who does each and everything in cloud world. Right? We kept ourselves quite niche, and that thing has actually has played up pretty well. Right? We wanted to go deep dive into Kubernetes. And that happens to be our primary or key skill set you might want to call, right? And at this point of time, 70% of our projects are on Kubernetes, and rest might be on some other container orchestration, but like Kubernetes and other cloud native technology is the primary key skill set.
Myself, Rajeev. So I've already been mentioned that I joined in 2017 as one of the full-time employees when we started the practices. I'm actually working as a technical architect, mostly working on multi-cloud deployments. At the same time, mostly working on the cloud native and cloud agnostic practices around with it. Laterwards, I think we started with one of the biggest clients of Srijan, and then we started to slowly operate out the cloud technologies, and then slowly we started to build end-to-end solutions for them, from the application onboarding to the deployments, deliveries, and then maintaining as well. So that was actually one of the good and best experience that we actually had. So we actually started to build a good confidence around with it, what we can do. That enabled us to pick up more projects, and then slowly down the road, now we diversified ourselves into the DevOps, not only into the one cloud, and now we have been into AWS, Azure, and at the same time, we started to mostly get deep into the other on-prem technologies, mostly like VMware and other stuff.
What does this modernization play really mean? What do you mean by modernization and a larger umbrella conversation?
Modernization word is can be used in multiple contexts. So typically how it is sort of seen in the current context, mostly how enterprises would see it, right? Like most of the organizations would want a modern architecture. And when by modern architecture, the base assumption is it should be microservices based, right? Perhaps there would be a bunch of APIs. And containers and Kubernetes is something which is sort of considered as a de facto, right? So basically, a modern application, to run a modern application, you might need a modern platform. And that particular modern platform is actually based entirely on Kubernetes and containers. But there is a caveat around it, right? Like I was talking to one of the senior leaders at a large company. He said, I'm getting a really high memory leak on one of my application. In case you solve that for me, right? That is actually a modernization for me. It's sort of, the actual answer is quite contextual in organization. But overall, majority term, right, it's moving towards microservices, moving towards more, API-driven architecture. And then from an infrastructure and cloud perspective, using containers, Kubernetes, and all other stuff.
Most of my experiences when it comes to the digital modernization or modernized platform modernization, more towards the same idea. Kubernetes and containerization become very de facto standards. Way before that, even Kubernetes, people opted out some other container orchestration tools, especially for the application modernization and platform modernization. But just simple an example, Apple Siri was actually used to be run it in Apache Nitro, and one of the the early adopters of the container orchestrations. But now these days, it's entirely been transformed as very more microservices architectures, more container orchestrations, and more into the Kubernetes, and people are getting more dig into the Kubernetes to use how they can actually modernize their platforms. I'm not more talking about the application side, but more into the platform side, like keeping one other centric point to do everything.
So what is the cloud practice's role in modernization? Does it actually build microservices architectures?
Let me answer that. It does not build the microservices architecture, right? It builds a platform on which you can actually sort of host your microservices, right? Or rather, you can sort of run your modern application, right? At the end of the day, for an organization, it's faster time to market, perhaps reducing the capex and opex, right? And then to do this, right, they might need a modern application, and then modern application would be based upon microservices, right? There would be more asynchronous communication perhaps using Kafka or some other message bus, right? And then maybe from a consumer perspective, like maybe your APIs are exposed, which is being proxied via an API gateway, maybe Kong, APG or something similar. And then at the end of the day, you would have your consumers, right? IoT devices, mobile devices, web applications. Now, all of these particular API gateways or microservices has to run on something, right? And that particular, something which we provide, right? We don't really deal with microservices, but we do understand the business problem, right? But we provide the core platform, right? At the end of the day, your microservices have to run on a certain platform, right? And then the core responsibility of our team is to creating that modern platform for your modern applications, you might want to call it. Right? So basically, and these particular modern platforms are typically created on any cloud provider, right? Maybe your AWS, GCP, or maybe on data center, right? And upon top of it, perhaps you might want to sort of use some sort of a Kubernetes, orchestra, some sort of a container orchestration, right? At this point of time, de facto is Kubernetes. Rajeev had actually sort of worked upon Apache Mesos Marathon, which is, I believe, like came into being much more before Kubernetes, right? And then like your base IaaS layer, Kubernetes, and then you might want to sort of build some flavor of CI/CD tooling, right? Like maybe at this point of time, our team actually uses, Argo CD, we use Spinnaker, we use Jenkins, right? And then since CI/CD would take care of your application onboarding and all of this, right? And then since things are on production, right? Like you can't really go into production without any observability, right? You need to sort of know what are the different application matrices, what are your different, matrices of your entire ecosystem, right? Then you would have some observability tool. At this point of time, basically, you would use Prometheus, Grafana, or something similar in the OpenStack segment. And then even in the VMware segment, we have, there are paid stuff like, Tanzu observability and App Dynamics, right? And then comes the logging and all that stuff, right? So in a nutshell, right, we don't really build microservices, right? We rather build the core platform on which your microservices actually run, or maybe your modern applications actually run.
And so who builds those modern applications? That's usually the in-house client teams or other vendors and stuff.
That's correct.
That's correct, right? What is Tanzu's role in, or VMware's role in doing what you do on a daily basis, or what your team does?
Ashish already been talked about the reducing the capital expenditure and operational expenditure, right? So if you have to do it, first you need to make sure that your infrastructure is also as much as modernized, decoupled in a way that actually things can be maintained independently, easily, but they should be coupled in other ways, right? In applications, you actually have the message bus, Kafka services, and other ones. So similar to the same idea, but you need to do everything centrally from one place, but able to manage them independently down the road. So that's where this Tanzu actually came into the picture in one side. But as actually was mentioned, 70% of most of our client infrastructure is actually being running on the Kubernetes. Their applications are actually running on the Kubernetes. Now, it's mostly, most of the cases are actually, some people are AWS, some people are Kubernetes, or some people actually are Azure, some other people actually opt the VMware solutions. So we need a unified solution which can actually handle any of these Kubernetes cluster much easily. Like I want to provision a Kubernetes cluster. So practically every DevOps engineer usually does, right? Write a Terraform code or use some solutions like Kops or some other solutions to provision the clusters. But each cloud actually has its own solution to do it. So rather than doing any of this sort of stuff, we need a unified tool to handle everything. So that's where like we have tools like TKG, Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, and we have other tools that are mostly like, okay, you provision your cluster, like who's going to maintain it? Who's going to looking for the cluster, like how it is being performing? I want to manage everything independently, all together in a single place. So that's where there are other products in the Tanzu usually comes into the picture. We have Tanzu Service Mesh, we have Tanzu Observability, we actually have TMC. So, and then we have other solutions that are actually been available to make everything centrally to manage, but which is for the observability perspective, like how my clusters have been doing and everything, but I could able to maintain these clusters independently. At the same time, I could able to have centralized logging, monitoring all together in a single place. So there are bunch of solutions that are actually available within the Tanzu ecosystem. We have mostly been working with almost 7 to 8 solutions together within Srijan. But there are a lot of other solutions that are actually been available. That's what actually Tanzu mostly does. We do things centrally, but can be maintained independently down the road as well.
Independently on multiple clouds without getting locked into whatever is the cloud platform specific practice for.
In very generic in nutshell, if I have to provision EKS cluster, I need to create VPCs, I need to create AM roles and policies, I need to define subnets and everything, and then I have to create the clusters, and then I have to add nodes to it and all the other stuff, right? But with a single command, I could able to provision this whole Kubernetes cluster with a single command with a smaller configuration file, and then I'm good to go. You just need to codify your configurations and then use the configurations to update, patch, and everything you can do with it. So that's what it actually does. Backend solutions, whatever the Tanzu does, the backend solutions are actually open sourced out by the VMware itself. Like it uses something called Cluster API provider for AWS, Cluster API provider for Azure. So these are actually the API integrations with the cloud platform. So what the CLI simply does, it calls that API providers to provision the actual infrastructure, right? It's very simple, but very elegant as well at the same time. So much easier to do. You don't need to have any cloud knowledge to provision these clusters. You don't need to understand how to configure the Kubernetes cluster, what commands I have to run. All will be done automatically. And the big part around here is actually not only to creating, right? Most of the images that are actually being certified by the VMware, so that actually you get the patches and everything is actually already being done properly by the VMware itself, so that you know already what you're running is on the secure platform. That's another thing that we could see it as well.
I'll try to answer Rajiv's question in a bit more. At the end of the day, what Tanzu sort of brings into picture, right? You can sort of think about it brings you a single experience across different cloud providers, right? Before Tanzu, every cloud provider might have their own experience, right? Now, in case I would like to have a Kubernetes cluster on AWS, I would sort of go the AWS experience way, or Azure experience way, or maybe data center experience way, right? And in that case, like 3 different things to sort of deal with, right? What Tanzu have sort of brought in, right? It is, at least from a cluster management perspective, basically a single interface, right? To deal with your clusters, like your cloud provider is just an abstraction, doesn't really matter. So basically, at the end of the day, right, a single experience right away from your cluster management to your observability, everything, right? That is something Tanzu sort of brings into picture, right? Now, particularly from the Vanguard perspective, right, it is a community of VMware users, right? By that I mean like your end users, right? There are a lot of organizations who are actually using VMware products right away from Tanzu, or maybe there are other products like your NSX and all this stuff. So this particular Tanzu Vanguard community is like a sort of an invite-only community, wherein like the different users of VMware are actually sort of invited, right? And then lately they have sort of started inviting service providers as well.
So this is not a tech community owned by employees of VMware, but they're also users of VMware, clients of VMware of their community as well.
VMware employees are not allowed, right? Basically, basically apart from the community manager and other folks who actually head the community, rest of the VMware guys are not really allowed. In case someone would like to be part of this community, right, they can, in fact, on VMware site, there is a form which they have to fill, which eventually goes to the community manager, I believe, and you sort of get interviewed, right? And then you eventually get into the Vanguard community. But in case someone, or maybe like internally from VMware, or maybe some existing Tanzu Vanguard community member actually endorses you, right? Then you sort of get a direct entry, right? You don't really have to sort of go via that particular entire interview process, right? So I was actually endorsed by one of my friends, one of a person with whom we work closely in VMware, right? And then after that, like since Rajeev was working pretty closely with me, one of the very large VMware projects on Tanzu, right? That's where basically I also sort of endorsed him, and that's how we sort of got into this. At this point of time, I believe we might be around 300 odd people.
It's not only the closed community part, but as mostly the end users usually being part of this one, who actually use the Tanzu products. So they also share their experiences, their pitfalls around with it. So we actually share some of our feedbacks to them as well. Like not only the products that we actually use out of it, we share our experience to the closed community people, so that they could also know exactly how to solve the problems, all those sort of stuff. So it's just not only the community to do the announcement, it's mostly towards to showcase around like, how we are actually been using the technology, like what are the problems that we have to be faced around with it, and how we actually come to a solution around with it. What things can be done in the right way, like, while we have been setting up this stuff, right? One of our biggest experiences actually when we opted out the TKG, Tanzu Kubernetes Grid. So we have seen a lot of not only the cluster management side, right? Like, it's a day-to operations also need to be taken into the considerations. So there are some of the features that are actually been missing out of the platform. So we actually went back to the community, within the Vanguard community. We actually explained them, like, what we have seen the good with it, what we actually not been, like, what things need to be added or improve the platform around with it. So they actually checked it, and some are actually been very excited that actually, like, okay, this is good, this is not good, this is bad. So all things actually happens. They actually provide the feedback at the same time, right? So it's not only like, even if you're only working on the TKG side, But as it's the modernization that we've been talking about here as well, right? Like, on the software defined network, NFX became widely been popular on the or the network solution on locally, but it's a very complex technology to understand it. So when we are actually been facing any problems, we actually reach out to the Vanguard team members to get help and support from them as well, like, how they have been done, so that we could able to solve the problem much faster pace. Because, like, you don't find these sort of things mostly in the internet, so you have to know the people who actually did really well. So,
sure.
Real-time implementation.
So the product also enhances because of your feedback. And do you have a role in the product itself?
So basically, you see, right, any opinion which is sort of, or a feedback which is shared to the product, right, that since it comes from a Vanguard community, there is a seriousness coefficient, right? Like that particular statement would be treated quite, seriously with the product team, right? Okay. Even if you sort of run into any issue, right, and in case a solution has been, suggested by a Vanguard community, right, it is treated like, because there are technically vetted people who have already tried the solution, right? Recently, there was an issue on, when all of us sort of remember, right, this log4j issue. So due to which basically a lot of clusters had to be actually upgraded, but at certain point of time, not everything could be upgraded. Certain things had to be actually patched. For that thing, basically a smallish, I wouldn't say hack, a smallish, workaround was actually provided by one of the Vanguard community members, and then other community members were actually, using that particular workaround and in fact tweeting about it, right? And then, so basically, since it has been already used by some other people, and then scale at which like the other team, Vanguard community members are actually sort of working with it, like it's quite large, right? Like probably it's like Fortune 500 companies.
Ashish and Rajeev, what is, you also do system reliability engineering, SRE, within the cloud group. What is SRE, and how is it relevant to both internal and external developers?
So SRE, like typically it's called SRE or PRE, like maybe like site reliability engineering or system reliability engineering or platform reliability. So the word itself is quite self-explanatory, right? Like the word reliability is there, right? Like the core principle around which reliability engineers actually sort of work, right? They work upon to create your systems much more reliable, right? At the end of the day, right, that is the core definition of the site reliability engineers, you might want to call, right? Their core job is to make the systems more reliable, and that leads to a lot of proactiveness, right? Taking example, we don't really wait for an application to sort of go down, right? Yeah. Rather stop an application via a proactive reliability and make that particular application go down. Right? Even if something goes down on a certain day, right? The learnings from that particular downtime are actually taken, and then are taken, and then via that particular learning, right, we come to a decision, hey, this happened this time, how I can actually sort of prevent it from happening this time, right? That is something which we are actually doing, right, as a part of our SRE team. So that is, and then at the end of the day, right, I did mention like we are the keepers of the production sites, right? So it's actually the SRE team who is actually the keepers of production sites. So we are operating across 24/7, and we have it grew from a non-existing practice to almost around 12 plus member team now, and then we are operating 24/7, like in the different shifts, and weekends and holidays is mostly on call, and then high degree of automation, right? So typically you see, right, whilst any incident happens for a customer, right, an incident either has already happened or is about to happen, right? So even in all of this particular scenario, everything is automated, right? Right away from your maybe ticketing tool, your Zendesk, Jira, and all of the stuff, or maybe your monitoring tool, right? Maybe your Prometheus, Grafana, your New Relic, App Dynamics, and all that stuff, right? Our incident management tool is actually integrated. So in case anything is happening or is about to happen or already happened, right? Our folks actually get called on their phone depending upon their shift. And then right away from your escalation metrics to your on schedule, right, everything's sort of automated. Take an example, I'm a junior SRE engineer, right? I've just joined the team. As an engineer, an incident has been assigned to me, but maybe I took longer than expected, right? At the end of the day, I was doing the right thing, right? Like I was trying to solve an issue, but we have to sort of meet the certain customers' SLAs. But as an engineer, I was trying to solve it, but that particular, time went beyond the SLA, right? So in case that automation is not present, like we end up breaching the SLAs. Even this thing we have sort of automated, right? In case I'm not able to solve it in 5 minutes, right? That tool sort of escalates to Rajeev, who happens to be a senior engineer, right? So that is something which we sort of do in SRE, right?
We don't see SRE more different than the DevOps in a way, because SRE implements the DevOps practices. That's what we actually define it. So within DevOps or SRE, mostly does similar sort of stuff. But as if I have to differentiate much, then DevOps usually be at the day zero and day one, and SRE comes from the day two to day infinity, like till the time. So that's how we actually differentiate it. But most actually work on these similar tools and technologies, and they actually actively involved with doing the implementations and everything around with it, especially more towards to understanding the day to operation side. And and like we not only it's not really production stuff, but we actually maintain everything end to end, especially on the servers, clusters, even application and everything. And we do other things as well around just for the maintenance side. So proactive monitoring and reactive monitoring, both we actually do it. That as has already been mentioned. So mostly on the proactive monitoring side, we have a lot of tools around with it. More on the reactive side, so we already have automated escalations and everything around with it. So we use a bunch of other tools around with the platform. And we also not only does that, we try to help the customer to build the distributed tracing and all the other stuff, so that we and application performance as well at the same time. So that to understand more deep into the stuff like how things are working, how the communication is actually happening. This enables the customer to define some sort of non-functional requirements, so that like we could able to reach those sort of SLAs around with that as well. Just not only saying that okay, my servers need to be up on 99.99% of time, or my application need to be up by 99.9% time. Yeah, it can be up, but what if the case your response time is more than 5 seconds? So that's also very important. So SRE actually handles those pieces around with it as well. Just not only the uptimes around the platform, but mostly to understand other non-functional requirements and making sure that that is actually being met as well at the same time.
What is the complexity of projects that you're handling?
Now, from a project complexity perspective, quite interesting project. We'll talk about the first one, which Rajeev and I actually did in 2017. That happens to be one of the largest microservices and DevOps transformation for one of our oldest customers. And that's where basically our entire journey with Kubernetes started, right? We started on AWS EKS. Probably we started just with 2 clusters, and then at this point of time, even I'm not really sure like the scale which they have sort of ran into, right?
So we have near about 400 plus nodes we actually have.
Probably around 40 plus clusters, right? And then that's an interesting one. And then some other interesting projects is for another media and publishing company based out of Southeast Asia. For them, we actually helped them to create an entire platform which was based on cloud native technologies, including Kubernetes. Right? And most of their current websites are actually running on the platform which was created by us. That's also on AWS. And then some interesting problems which we have actually solved is, right, because for us, basically, we are not really, while you use Kubernetes, like there are 2 aspects, right? Like not really use Kubernetes from an operations perspective, right? Like, but also to extend it. So that is something which we do in some of our projects. So one interesting thing which we did for a customer based out of US, for which we had to actually do what, right? Depending upon a lot of that customer is into, you would actually get a caption on your phone, depending upon whatever a person is sort of speaking, right? For that, we had to take a lot of
voice to text.
Yeah. For that, we had to take a lot of data, right? Like and run bunch of machine learning workloads, right? And typically within the Kubernetes ecosystem, right, everything sort of scales horizontally, right? Like in case you would have, take an example, one instance of your microservice is running, right? In case you need to sort of scale, right, you can actually maybe run multiple instances, right? That's actually in a Kubernetes concept, that's actually called a pod. So typically in Kubernetes, by default, you would scale your pods either using memory or using maybe CPU, right? But in this particular case, we had to actually scale your pods using a GPU matrix, right? So that particular matrix does not come out of the box, right? So basically, we actually ended up writing a custom matrix. And then apart from that, like recently, due to our partnership with VMware, right? And we are doing a bunch of interesting projects with them, mostly in Asia and Asia Pacific. So mostly it's like large scale implementation of Tanzu, right? Across like when the customers are like, we are in telcos and bunch of gaming companies as well. And then Rajeev is actually sort of working on another project, which is a fintech company based out of Bangladesh. Yeah, mostly like a Kubernetes project, but like from a overall complexity perspective, right? It's just not using Kubernetes from a operations perspective, but there could be certain cases wherein we might actually want to end up I would sort of say, right, extending Kubernetes also is something which we typically do in our projects.
One of the recent projects that we are currently been working on is also use Kubernetes very extensively, but not towards the application deployments, but use Kubernetes as an operator to do the build and deployments. So the client actually have Jenkins. So if you're giving a but more technical way, so they don't want to maintain the Jenkins by themselves manually. So they need an automated process around it. So what actually happened is we defined some custom resource definitions, and then we have custom controllers around with the Kubernetes. So you could able to automate your Jenkins builds and deployment processes and everything through that. So on top of it, there is already a UI interface has been created. So that actually called as deployment manager. So that actually does is you go and do the deployments in the tool, and that transform into Kubernetes object, that transfer it into the Jenkins. So you don't need to go to the Jenkins at all. So everything you do it in a single interface itself. So that way we are not only using just Kubernetes for deploying applications to it, but actually maintain the infrastructures around it as well. For example, maintain the Jenkins. There are other controllers are available to maintain your cloud platforms as well. So that's where the cluster API providers usually do that. So these sort of things are also we are actually doing. So mostly not only just adopting Kubernetes as just for an applications, but more towards to do other things. So down the road, slowly Kubernetes becoming the centric point for everything. So that is one of the main reason actually most of our projects are being into the Kubernetes. So just not only do the application deployment. And if you talk about this complexity around it, so we have been working into very smaller scale projects to the very enterprise scale, large projects around with the enterprise scale ones. So starting with the smaller instances, down the road we slowly extending that back to the very large scale ones. So we actually adopted different set of tools and solutions to maintain these things. And we have Kubernetes clusters starting with 4 nodes to the 20 plus nodes as well. Like Ashish has been mentioning, we have 40 plus clusters in one of the clients. So they actually have this sort of environment. So which actually have horizontal scaling, vertical scaling. So we have the vertical scaling at the pod level, and we have horizontal scaling at the node level, so that you could able to scale the way you wanted, right? Scaling at the node level is a bit difficult. So we actually opted out both the solutions around with it. So you could able to achieve at any sort of scaling that you needed in the cloud platform, irrespective of your what sort of your application behavior is, right? So that's actually one of the good things. So complexity wise, if I talk more deeper into the concepts around with it, we have been working with one of the gaming projects. So what happens in this case is actually this provision is actually done by the TKG. So the clusters are already been done, everything is already been done. Now you need horizontal scaling around the platform. We don't perform vertical scaling here because not all applications supports horizontal scaling. So we slowly start to adopt the vertical scaling for these parts as well, so that we can able to scale out our clusters in a way that actually based on your application, right? Like not all applications support horizontal scaling. If you have big monolithic application, you cannot say, I want to scale it horizontally because they use the common pool of resources. It won't work. So there you needed that vertical scaling. So we are actually started to adopting that vertical scaling features for this customer as well to enhance their application performance. So that at the end user will get the better response on their any non-functional requirement stuff can be satisfied down the road.
To at this point, right, though at this point of time, majority of our workloads might be on some cloud provider, right, like AWS, GCP, or maybe on data center. One thing which practice which we are trying to do is, right, like go into edge computing. We had CDN, right? Back in the past, basically people sort of thought like, hey, my static assets, my HTML, CSS, it takes a lot of time to serve it, right? Can we serve it from network, right? So that's where basically your CDN sort of evolved, right? So to get your static asset, you don't really have to sort of go to your end server, right? They can be actually served via your network, right? Now, since these network devices or maybe your edge devices have maybe memory, they have CPU, right? Since they have certain computation power, right? We can very well sort of run a Kubernetes cluster, right? So that actually sort of comes into edge computing, right? Now, sort of imagine in this fashion, there is an Airtel tower next to your house. There is some sort of a box sitting out there, right? You can very well sort of run a Kubernetes cluster out here. That is something which we are sort of doing out here. Yeah. This is something research and learning perspective, which some of our team members are actually doing, right? Yeah. So perhaps like for us, like the Kubernetes does not really matter, right? Back in the past, the cloud didn't matter. Now Kubernetes does not matter wherever it is, right? It could be on data center. Yeah. Maybe I don't know, it could be on a watch as well. Perhaps I think that's possible. You can actually run a Kubernetes cluster on some sort of an Android watch. It should be possible. At least like you can do it on Raspberry Pi.
Yeah, we have micro KATS clusters. We do it locally.
Why should people from outside join your team?
Yeah, that is an interesting question, right? Firstly, why should they join is particularly from a project learning perspective. the scale is quite large as we sort of work with Fortune 500 companies, and then support system is also quite large, right? I would sort of say, right, knowing things is, I typically say this thing to most of our team, right? Not knowing thing is okay, but like not seeking help and not putting an effort is not okay, right? So how we sort of operate is like we have a channel called Platform SRE. In case anyone gets stuck, right? We have already raised this thing to a team member. In case you get stuck, in case you're sort of getting stuck for a really long time, seek help, right? That's how we have been sort of operating, right? And that happens to be
So an internal Srijan cloud community.
Yes, internal Srijan cloud. Because at the end of the day, right, let's say, in case I get stuck, right, like Rajeev might have actually solved it. That is something comes quite core to our group, right? And that is something which we are sort of trying to do as well. Because at the end of the day, right, you wouldn't get really senior people, right? That would sort of lead to hiring challenges, right? So that's how we are sort of trying to operate. And then how to do it more efficiently, that is something which we have to actually learn.
I can give you a best example of myself here, right? When I was joined in 2017, I had a question start actually, am I taking the right decision or not? Because it was a new domain that the team is actually been opting it out. But one good thing here is actually like you have chance to explore whatever you wanted. At the same time, you have your opinion matters within Srijan, right? One thing is actually you say this tool is good, you just have to justify why it is good, and then it's done, right? There is no lot of tons of approach doesn't need it here, right? And then that opinions matters a lot. And plus at the same time, every engineer feels satisfied more towards is actually, okay, I said this tool and it is being considered and it is being operated out within the big scale project. So that's very important for everybody at the personal satisfaction level. And that you can get out of the box within Srijan. So that's one of the main reasons around it. If you look at the bigger enterprise companies, it's a bit hard to do it. But with this scale, even if you have 40 plus people, still your opinion matters within Srijan. At the same time, so we are not bounded to one technology. So we've been into more than one now. So initially it used to be only concentrating on one cloud, but now we've been into more than one cloud. And at the same time, we try to make sure that people are cross-functional, especially on the knowledge side. So that like it doesn't necessarily that you have been working on AWS doesn't mean you have to only work on AWS and learn only AWS. So you are allowed to learn any technology at any point of time. So as I said, like for learning perspective, there is no boundaries within Srijan. And like we mostly work on cutting edge tools and technologies, if that matters to anyone. But at the same time, we try to standardize the platforms across the projects as well, so that if any case, if person want to work on another project because they want to move and swap to another project, they want to do it. It's not that there is a big learning curve for anybody else. Tools that we actually been opted out is very much standardized in a way that actually like it's mostly been opted by the enterprise organizations as well. At the same time, even if the tool is everybody knows it, there is something we actually try to find it out something different to other ones. So that's what we try to do it. So that like every day when you start your day, exactly like you're not doing something every day you do it. Sometimes you have to do something beyond it, because as Ashish mentioned one of the point there, we have a closed channel within the group. Like anybody can reach out to anybody to ask a question around it or take a help from somebody. So this is very hard. Like if I'm working on a VMware project and somebody is working on an AWS and Azure, so you come back and ask me, like, Rajeev, I need help on somewhere, right? But as within Srijan, people actually have transfer knowledge across the platform. So this enables everyone to start to help each other and support each other in a way that actually like, it doesn't necessarily, it is on Kubernetes, it is on AWS, it is on EC2 instances. You can get help from anybody else.
From open source communities culture.
97%, I don't say 100%, but 97 to 98%, most of the tools are open source that we opted. And plus, at the same time, we not only opt the tool in a way, it's an open source one. We try to look for like, whether it is cloud native or cloud agnostic, and what customer actually wanted down the road for next 3 years, right? When we started in 2017 for one of the old customer of Srijan, so they have very clear instructions to us that maybe down the road we may go to the data center, not to the we may or may not be stick in the public cloud, or we may go to the hybrid cloud. So the way we actually operate the tools around it is actually mostly cloud agnostic, like in monitoring tools, logging solutions, even the cluster managements or anything. So we try to be more cloud agnostic there. So some cases customers say, okay, we know for next 5 years we're not going to look for any. Okay, now we are in AWS, we don't want to go to Azure, or we are in Azure, not going to the GCP. Then we know exactly what they've been looking for. So then that case, we mostly go with the cloud native approach around like relying on the tools which has already been provided by the cloud provider. For example, continuous deployment, continuous integration. In generic solutions, Jenkins is the de facto standard. But if the customers say we need to be cloud native, then we have to opt it out, code build, code pipeline, code deploy, sort of these features. so that as they already know they don't want to go to that. But we try to make sure that we, as much as possible, try to opt it out as the cloud native or cloud agnostic ones, not just like an enterprise solution surrounded it, because you have to rely on it. So we always suggest to the customer to go with the back out as well, right? But this again, it's a customer choice around it at the end. If they want it, then if not the case, we actually provide the pros and cons around both the ways.
Thank you. So a lot of consulting as well with customers, I imagine, that goes along. There is one aspect of developers moving their careers from, say, programming in Drupal, writing modules or backend Drupal, for example, to moving to the DevOps and cloud team. But is there also an opportunity for people to become better programmers if they come in to the team for short-term deployment, if you like, and if they move back, are they going to be better developers if they spend 6 months, say, in the cloud team, the DevOps team, learning the tools and technologies? Is their career even staying in the Drupal path? Are they going to be better people, better programmers, better leaders?
There are two aspects, right? From a programming perspective, you see, right, in the cloud and DevOps ecosystem, the programming is something which we don't do much, right? But only some team members actually might have to do programming. But what they might sort of get better is, right, because at the end of the day, we have to deal with your operating system at your network at a really low level, right? Typically, while you're sort of working at the application there, right, a lot of things are actually abstracted from you, right? But like for us, like our work involves like a lot of working at the low levels of your network, low level of the operating system, right? In case you want to sort of go deep dive, right? And in fact, in the background, right, for a Drupal developer, it might be, hey, like my application is running on a Kubernetes cluster, right? But out there, like how exactly it is sort of running on a Kubernetes cluster, in case something goes not bad in the network, right? Like then how you actually sort of debug a DNS issue, or maybe a sort of a firewall issue, or maybe sort of a port issue, right? In case you want to sort of go deep dive into that aspect, right? Which I believe a lot of that would add a lot of value to your career path, yeah, and then to your learning as well. And then another is, right, like while you are DevOps team or the SRE team, you might want to call, right? They are the keepers of production, you might want to call, right? Yeah. Typically, building things is okay, right? Like that is something wherein you sort of learn stuff, right? But while you are sort of maintaining large scale application on a production grade, right? Yeah, that amount of learning which you will sort of have in a 30 minutes of a production issue, that is something which you can't sort of have in probably in ages, right? Yeah, in 30 minutes you'll sort of diagnose something, and depending upon that particular RCA, right, you'll sort of learn something. Yeah, that is really, really hard to find, right? That would be my suggestion, right? Programming, not much, right? But in case more deep dive knowledge of your core systems, that is something which you'll sort of get into this practice.
The one thing definitely they will say, right? Developers usually complain that it is working in local systems, but not in the production.
Yeah.
Once they've been part of DevOps team, after 6 months, they'll say they know exactly why it is not working in the production, not in local. How to solve it as well at the same time, right? Like because
very nice.
Traveling with the DevOps team actually enables them to look at how they're building it, how they're deploying it, how they're actually maintaining at the certain level. Even if they're not completely part of the managed services or the SRE team, they know exactly, right? So they understand the pain points around with it, right? Like now at the same time, they get able to provide the feedback because they build the applications, so they get able to provide the right feedback around it, actually how they should be running, like what should be configured. So definitely they will know more deep into why things are not working in the production. They always work in the local systems.
So maybe they're not better Drupal programmers or programmers in general, but better engineers.
Yeah, that will be definitely sure, right? They can upskill themselves more towards, right, not just say, okay, I build my application locally, I push the code into the GitHub, but you'll start to understand how things are getting built, how things are getting deployed, and how things are getting maintained, right? Even if you do it practically or not, and you're doing the stuff in the production, but still you get that large scale of large view around the stuff. So that enables them to say, okay, if something goes wrong in the production, they know exactly, right? At least they can actually enable SRE team to debug the issue much faster. So the turnaround time for the issue fixing much lower W.
What would be your message to external developers, DevOps engineers, cloud engineers working out there? Why should they come and join your practice at Srijan?
So firstly, in case you would like to work in a culture with a high amount of responsibility, right, with a support system, obviously, that's where basically we bring on the table. Technical is like other part of it, right, like Kubernetes and like Kubernetes and all other stuff. Like in case someone has that particular willingness to own a large system and with a high degree of responsibility, right, that is something I would sort of say, right, that because that is something which we actually do. And then from a learning perspective, right, since Rajeev also mentioned, right, like we are at the cutting edge, right, to Kubernetes and cloud native technologies, which we are sort of using quite well. And then just like in the DXP ecosystem, right, like we are not just using it, right, we are actually contributing back as well, right. And Spinnaker was one such tool in the cloud native ecosystem, right, which we have used it and then we knew it up to so level of, details. And we used to help people on Spinnaker channel in the public forum. Up to a certain extent, then people sort of started sending us direct messages. Then we stopped doing it. Like, hey, like I'm stuck in this issue. Can you help me? But in the public forum, we have sort of helped them. So so basically, in case you have a high degree of work in a culture with a high degree of responsibility, work on cutting edge technology, right, and also love to sort of contribute back to open source, right, because that is something which we not just appreciate, we actually I would say reward, right? Any person who does contributions, right? Typically, what we try to do, right, like help them with a certain reward, right? Maybe it could be because back in the past, while before COVID, our entire team actually went to Kubernetes forum in Bangalore. Right? Entire Goa team and the Bangalore team went there, and the entire NCR team actually went to the Delhi one. Right? Same thing which we would like to do, right? Like whilst you're sort of working on a project and contributing back to any open source community, right? Like people who sort of do with consistency, right? Like probably what we plan to do is, right, whilst we sort of start having maybe KubeCons and DockerCons, right? The same practice which we sort of do in the DXP ecosystem, people who do contribution consistently to Drupal, right? They sort of send to DrupalCon, right? Same thing, same culture we would like to sort of apply here as well.
You are very interested to learn the stuff, at the same time do impact within the projects or within the business, right? Not the smaller scale, but the larger scale side. Yes, Srijan is the right choice. Especially as I said, like your opinion matters. That's very important. At the same time, we not only working on the cutting edge technologies, at the same time, we do a lot of POCs, which is like even people are not actually opting it out or not. So we do a lot of POCs around within. So as like any tool, we try to look for alternative more than one tool at a time, so that like we will be well prepared that actually what solution can fit for the customer. So rather than somebody is taking the decision, it's a people actually in the hand, like individual DevOps engineers or the senior DevOps engineer actually do this stuff, right? Rather than something technical architect or somebody actually doing it. So everybody owns some sort of responsibility more towards what you want to inculcate within your projects. So that usually don't happen in a lot of organizations, but it actually happens here. At the same time, for the external developers, as I said, right, like we always welcome with open hands for any developers to be part of our team. At the same time, there is a lot can be done within the Kubernetes ecosystem to, especially towards like the automation stuff and everything. So if an external developer want to be part of us, that's always welcome. More towards, we have some ideas around with actually what type of automation we can bring it to the cloud, at the same time to the internal tools as well. So we could able to take your help to do the stuff. So we always welcome. Currently, we most of our DevOps engineers are a bit less coding. Yeah, we do coding, but mostly like at the Lambda level, we do the coding at some part of, but not like entirely. So any developers, internal, external ones, always welcome to the team, so that we could able to take your help to do more automation around with it. To more towards like more towards like try to be very proactive at the same time. Reducing the operational expenditure, more towards like if you do automation extensively, machines don't do mistakes until we made it to do mistakes. So we want to do that, bring more automation to the platforms, and then like reduce especially onboarding times towards the customers, at the same time like reduce the capital expenditure as well.
Do you want to speak a little bit about any aspects on culture that you have experienced yourself as a consumer and of culture, and something you have sort of helped create, and perhaps both to you and Rajeev?
I'll take a real life example, right? And then honestly speaking, due to certain current remote setup, certain aspects do not come that clear, right? But a recent one, right? Like there was one of our team members who had actually recently quit. But after a month, so he came back. And lately what happened, one of our guy he got down with COVID. And due to which a guy who had sort of joined on that particular same day, he was put in as a replacement. And you can sort of yourself imagine, right? Like your onboarding has actually started on that same day. You are sort of put in a project which is almost at its end.
Tough customer, tough project situation.
Tough project situation. Basically, then in that case, what I did, right? Basically, who I'm sort of talking about, right? I'd added as a support for our new team member guy, right? And then since such instances sort of happened at two different places, right? As the guy I'm sort of talking about, I had recently joined it. I sort of put him at 50% capacity at two different places, and both of them had a equal priority, right? Or maybe like a competing priority you might want. And then was added a support, right? And then after that, basically, he sort of called me, right? Hey, Ashish, he sort of mentioned me like, let's not put in two different projects, right? Do what? Maybe like find a replacement for in the other project, right? And perhaps like then I'm okay to sort of support both of the projects till the time one of our other team member actually sort of comes, sort of recovers from an illness, right? So such a small gesture, right? A guy who has sort of just not really just joined us, like perhaps with us for last 2 years, right? In case it is sort of showing how to say such inclination.
2 years showing so much maturity that when you're bringing somebody from outside fresh and you put him on a tough project, don't do that.
Yes.
They are coming up with advice and it's being
That's
heard.
Correct. It's being heard, right? And then that's correct.
I call that collective wisdom. I call that I'm not the smartest person in the room. I'm mine for collective intelligence.
That's correct. Because back in the past, right, like all of us, majority of our team members were in Goa, right? We have actually sort of worked quite closely. So we sort of understand, right, how as an organization, how we sort of operate. Entire culture aspects of the organization eventually sort of goes to our practice as well, right?